right now I've got returning for the first time in 2019, Steve Hawkins, the CEO of Horizons ETFs. Steve, welcome back.
James, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Steve, the Horizons ETF is, it's looking like it was a safe place to be relative to a lot of other stocks in the sector, in the cannabis sector. What's your outlook for 2019 in terms of what you're liking in the ETF?
Well, I mean, I think this is sort of a continuation of the same story that we've had over the past month. You know, we saw huge equity market volatility, and we actually saw outside of Aphria, we saw a nice started uptick in the cannabis stocks. It's almost like a volatility or inverse volatility play to the equity markets. So we're going to see equity market volatility, we hope, settle down here, but we're seeing a continued nice little run in the cannabis space right now, especially with all the continued short-term news, new research analysts coming online with big firms like RBC, Piper Jaffray, picking up Canadian stocks, U.S. stocks. You know, RBC now as a bank saying that they're going to get involved in the investment banking side of the deals in the space. That's all very, very continued positive news. And right, as we know, this has been an extremely news-driven sector. You know, the short sellers on Aphria, I think, are getting screwed right now, which is great, I think, for the industry. And I think people not overreacting to those types of stories anymore. I think some people will hopefully have learned a little bit of a lesson here, and we'll start to see volatility come down a little bit, I think, but we're going to continue to see a nice little slide upward in the sector.
So the macro, so we've been sitting here this afternoon looking at the market. The market's on a tear. We're trying to find a macro catalyst that we can point to say, well, this is what's driving the market. We can't find anything, but from what you're saying, it's actually a combination of these catalysts in sort of the upper levels of the major banking sector that are too high for us to see, and so we don't really know what's going on, and so, but that's a reasonable explanation.
I think it's one of the drivers, but I think, you know, people going into year end were still a little jittery of what was going on, and then they saw huge equity market volatility, and marijuana stocks were a safe haven. You know, even though there's a lot of intraday volatility in a lot of names, we were seeing some nice flows into our ETF, especially because we provide a broader, diversified exposure to the sector. You know, and I would not have wanted to own Aphria personally when it dropped by, you know, almost 100%. And but I would, you know, we were on the ride on the way down, but we were on the ride on the way up. So it's, you know, it's been up. I think it's up 80% since from its lows already in less than a month. I mean, that's great, I think, for the sector. And you know, just news generally, what's going on with Canopy. You know, with respect to their stores and they're working deals out. Aphria closing the Germany deal. You know, financials started actually being reported from a real-time perspective. You know, maybe some of them are slightly under evaluation, but of expectations, but they're still coming in very, very positive on a year-over-year basis. You know, you have one of the lead analysts in the U.S. now saying that they think they underestimated U.S., Canada, and global medical marijuana sales. You know, I mean, that's also a nice little catalyst. I mean, all these nice little kicks in the butt, I think, for the sector are great.
Interesting. So then, if you were a betting man, would you bet that this positivity that we're seeing in the whole sector is likely to continue? Even, like, I'm looking at the S&P today, it's up like 0.2%. So it's not like correlated to the broader market. And I'm looking at the broader market, it looks like there's a lot more risk in there, especially as it pertains to Brexit and China-US relations and interest rates, et cetera. But the cannabis market's just saying, like, yeah, that doesn't pertain to us.
That is absolutely true. Like, none of those macro factors affect the cannabis space, which is very, very interesting, and why you can actually use cannabis as a hedge against general market activity right now. So, you know, for me, from a shorter and longer term perspective thing, I mean, we've seen a nice little rise here, like 20-25% in the past month, which, you know, we were expecting last time I was on the show in earlier December. You know, we were starting to see a nice little consolidation phase, and I said, look for a nice little breakout right now. Boom, it's already happened. So what's going to happen from here? I'm hoping that, you know, there'll be continued positive news, and is that going to drive it higher? Maybe. I mean, I think we might consolidate again a little bit here before we see another nice little jump higher. But I still continue to see 2019 as a nice, we're going to see some nice uptick in the cannabis sector. And I think more specifically, especially in the US names that are listed in Canada, I think those are relatively undervalued to the Canadian companies. And so I think if we're going to look for more specific upside, I think that's where I would be focused on a short-term basis.
Right.
But I'm still very, very positive about the long-term prospects of the cannabis sector, especially in Canada.
Yeah, you bet. The US MSOs that are listed in Canada have typically been characterized by underperformance since their IPOs.
Yep.
And their prices, the share prices themselves coming into the market as an IPO have been, eye-poppingly high relative to where Canadian companies tend to start. Now granted, the US markets, as each one is essentially a distinct market the way things are far more numerous and far larger each and of themselves. So when you say that you think they're undervalued, do you think they're undervalued relative to the size of their markets or relative to, on a dollar for dollar basis, Canadian stocks?
The latter. So I think when you're looking at it just on a pure fundamental basis, from a quantitative perspective,
right,
I think the Canadian companies are a little bit more overvalued than the US companies, especially after this little run. But I think that spread is narrowing and it's going to continue to narrow. But a month ago, that spread was significantly more. Even though we've seen a nice run in Canadian stocks, we've seen a pretty good run in the US stocks. But on an overall basis, I think that spread is narrowing, but I still think US stocks are quantitatively undervalued relative to Canadian companies.
Okay, so HMMJ does not invest in Canadian companies operating in the US, though, is that correct?
That is correct.
Right, so, I mean, looking at the performance of the US ones relative to the Canadian ones, has that been sort of turned out to be a blessing in disguise in that you haven't been able to participate in those big overpriced IPOs that came out and crapped the bed out of day one?
In some cases, for sure. But it also hindered us when you have companies like Tilray who did their IPO at $17 and then traded up to $195 kind of thing, right? And we weren't able to buy it coming in after the IPO market because we're not as nimble as an active portfolio manager can be. But when you still look at it on a long-term basis, people were shorting Tilray. Tilray's price has been extremely volatile. A lot of people got out of Tilray, at $150, at $100, even down to $75. We continued to own the stock, and we've been able to appreciate, see the nice appreciation in the value once we had averaged in on a stock price basis. So, active management can have some short-term positives things for you, but owning a nice passive vehicle like HMMJ, even though it doesn't own companies operating in the US, still is giving us a really nice broad exposure to the marijuana market, especially since the Canadian companies are now operating outside of Canada. The Aurora deal that closed in Germany. There's lots of global expansion going on with respect to marijuana generally and the cannabis space, and so we're getting global exposure out of our Canadian companies. Again, we talked about this before, but this is where this is the great thing about Trump. He's given the Canadian companies a leg up on the world over the U.S. companies because they can't get out of their states.
Right.
And we love that from a Canadian company perspective.
You bet.
But I mean, the U.S. company investors are not seeing the benefits yet. So.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Steve. Well, that's great perspective as usual. We'll leave it there and come back to you in a week or so. And thank you very much for joining me once again.